it isn't obvious at all that science can provide us with guides as to what constitutes the appropriate values. And it's not obvious to scientists. In fact, I would say that science in some sense was designed so that that was something it didn't even try to do.
I was on YouTube in 2006, right? And then 2009 doing every week. And there were no conservatives. There were no real Christians. No one of significant note, not like today, like yourself or other Christian and political channels out there, self-help, however we want to describe them. It was the edgy atheist territory, right? It was you were an atheist or bust. And I watched them sort of always try and attack Christians, and I wouldn't say in a way that's completely unfounded with, well, how do you reconcile your religion in the face of this scientific data? You know, that's what they would often be arguing, or the evolution argument was very big back then. Whereas now, I see it on the flip side where, especially in this sort of era of COVID, where, like you're talking about, in muddying the lines, sometimes science has tried to insert itself and almost replace religion. And people, not necessarily science itself, but people have tried to turn to science as a religion for example, things that are unexplainable sometimes.
Well, the other problem that comes up there, as far as I can tell, and Sam Harris has tried to address this, although I don't think he's done it successfully, is that we're always faced with the problem of perception and action. We have to see the world, we have to hear the world, we have to interact with the world through our senses, and we have to act. None of that's optional. And even to perceive something, you have to select what's important and what isn't. So if you listen to someone in a crowded room, you focus in on their speech and not on the speech of the people in the background.
Right.
And so you prioritize that person's speech in the hierarchy of value that guides your perception. Well, so you're stuck with existing inside a system of value. There's no way out of that. Well, it isn't obvious at all that science can provide us with guides as to what constitutes the appropriate values. And it's not obvious to scientists. In fact, I would say that science in some sense was designed so that that was something it didn't even try to do. Right. Because it's trying to present an objective viewpoint, devoid of, to the degree that it's possible, devoid of a priori value judgments. But then you have this whole domain of, well, we need to make judgments of value. Well, okay, where do they come from? And when I point out, for example, that there are things that call to you experientially that are outside of rationality, I would say to the atheists, well, why don't you look at the science of religious experience, let's say, or that domain, and try to account for that from within your particular perspective. If you criticize the religious people for not following the science, it's what are you going to do with this fact that human beings are wired, for example, to admire and to imitate that which they find calls them to a greater self.
Right.
That's the instinct for imitation. And so what is it we're imitating? And why do we imitate that particular value? And so that's a domain of unexplored mystery, and it has to be taken seriously. This isn't a matter of mere rationality, by no means.
And I think you make a great point about the hierarchy of values, and so you end up looking toward a messianic figure. I mean, this is kind of what was supposed to be beautiful to me about the scientific process. I hate the word the science now. The science is the equivalent to, it is an equivalent to religion, just like Scientology at a certain point. They put science in the name, the science, especially if someone says that with a Fauci pillow in their office, which Governor Whitmer did of my wonderful home state of Michigan. Science, what was beautiful about it is that it wasn't determined by consensus. Like you said, that was by design, it was determined by truth. It didn't necessitate, and as a matter of fact, it rejected people saying, this is the right science because of consensus. No. If the consensus is the world is flat, but it's wrong, the science says that you're wrong. And now we're at this point where people don't even understand. They're making these same religious judgments and saying, when we say trust the science, we're saying Fauci. Well, hold on a second. What about when Fauci goes against the World Health Organization? What about when the World Health Organization doesn't actually correspond with the CDC? What about the fact that you have other scientists at the time, for example, who've come out and said Fauci was wrong while he was talking about the fact that if you lived in a home with a parent who had AIDS, you could catch it from a cereal box. This is all on the record. You had all kinds of other scientists who are more qualified who said, this is not the guy, and people, in not understanding that they've made this value judgment, have said, no, I've decided he's the guy. And this is a real problem right now because, this kind of brings me, and I hope that this all makes sense, and you can just tell me if I'm stammering. I've always said my litmus test for a conspiracy theory, when you have to kind of dismiss it, right? You can't go through every conspiracy that someone brings up. You'd have to debunk. You'd have too much to debunk. You do have to start with how many people is they? How many people is they in this conspiracy theory? How many people have to be involved?
So one of the things you're suggesting implicitly is that one of the ways we establish value judgments is through consensus, but that isn't how we do science. And fair enough, but it does point to some mechanism for the establishment of value. So if you're trying to figure out what's important, what isn't, well, one way you can do that is to see what people in general think, and that might be a reasonable thing to do. But as you pointed out, that's not part of the scientific process. Certainly not. It'd be very weak if it was.
Right. And now I guess my point that I was going to sort of, in where we live, the domain, big tech, this sort of sphere where we, one point, we're really grateful that there weren't gatekeepers. The conspiracy now, when we say, hold on a second, we're talking about Fauci, the CDC, and scientific guidelines that fly in the face of other scientific guidelines, the they in this conspiracy is really only about 5 heads of organizations. People have decided about 5, you're talking about 5 companies and about 2 or 3 international governing bodies who determine what is allowed to be spoken, regardless of your scientific qualifications, for it to be considered proper or misinformation. And by the way, they can change that a week from now. And we've documented at least 20-something times. That to me is religious dogma.
I talked to John Anderson last week. He's was the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia a variety of years ago, a number of years ago.
Right.
He was finance minister when they ran something like 5 consecutive budget surpluses nationally. That's a hell of an accomplishment for a Western democracy, man. So he's a very sensible guy. And we were talking about what was happening in Australia underneath this as a consequence of the COVID pandemic and various other causes. And his point essentially, too, was that, well, because politicians in some sense are abdicating their responsibility, we're forcing medical people to make what are essentially political decisions. And so just as much of the problems that beset us politically are a consequence of the bleeding over of religious concerns into the political domain, we now have bleeding over of the scientific concerns into the political domain because politicians are using these experts as proxies for their own particular, for pushing forward their own particular ideological positions. And that's a very dangerous misuse of science. And so you see that in the climate change discussion too, where the insistence is, well, here's the problem, and this is the magnitude of the problem, and it's a moral issue, and you have to accept that, or you're not a good person, or you're ignorant, or you're malevolent, you're a bad person fundamentally. But the part of the reason that insistence is there is because there's a pack of solutions at hand in that person's imagination that are usually ideological in nature. Yeah. And if the first proposition is true, then that the imposition of that particular set of solutions is a fait accompli. And so not examining that is extraordinarily dangerous because if you have that ideological set of solutions, then you're going to be extraordinarily tempted to co-opt the force of the scientific endeavor as a justification for your political ambitions. It's very difficult for people to separate those sorts of things out. Like I believe personally, I believe this, is that it's very, very probable to me that massive solutions to the climate change problem, like global scale solutions, even national scale solutions, are going to cause far more trouble than the problem itself will cause. I really believe that.
Watch Louder with Crowder live, Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. Eastern.